of all, an apology. There's been a small problem today, but beyond our control. We were going to be more careful and more vigilant from next time on. Friend, it's wonderful to reassemble with all the IT80 bar members through the study circle. I begin with a prayer that all of you and your families are well and that it continues in this fashion. Let's hope there is no third wave and all of you remain safe and happy. We look forward to seeing you physically, and hopefully we will bump into each other in the physical hearings, which are slowly and steadily starting in the IT80. And if all goes well, we'll have a physical study circle meeting by the end of this year, maybe to send off 2021. With that, I welcome the guests of honor today, Mr. M.S. Sayali, Senior Advocate. Sayali Saab is a pride of the bar, senior because of his knowledge and not because of the way he looks. He is an effervescent personality and is always young. He has a very sharp mind and is known for his out of the box solutions. Well known in India and all over the world. We always look forward, Sayali Saab, to hear your views and to have you participate with us. Sanjeev Chaudhary is a well-known CA who has been in the Central Council of the Institute of Chartered Accountants in India and has been a partner in leading international firms. His vision and wisdom is phenomenal, and so is his knowledge. Sanjeev, we look forward to your participating here. Gaurav Jain, a humble man, extremely knowledgeable, yet unassuming. He had a tough run-in with COVID, and I'm sure that the whole bar, without any exception, prayed for his recovery.
Yes, definitely.
We are all very happy to have you back in action, Gaurav.
Thank you, sir.
We look forward to your views. Last of all, we have the ever-dependable think tank, Tarandeep Singh, advocate and CA. He is a part of Sayali Saab's team and therefore has the same style, knowledge, flamboyance, and yet is very humble and helpful. As you're aware that all people who will guide us today constitute the wealth of the IT80 bar. And imagine if we were to be assessed under the Wealth Tax Act, we would run out of funds. With that, I set the afternoon in motion, and Tarandeep and Ajay will take over from here. And I look forward to hear great views. Thank you very much.
Yes, I won't stand much longer between the experts and all of you. Just to set the rules, we have identified three very important documents. In fact, Taran and Gaurav have done so. So I think, Taran, you are going to start first.
First, we are taking the Karnataka High Court, so Gaurav will have to start.
So Gaurav will start with 147. He will quickly explain to us what the decision is all about. He will also raise the issues, because that's only when the experts will come in. So in about 10 minutes, Gaurav, you will be the master of the show. You will raise the issues, and Sayali Saab will endeavor to respond. Sanjeev will also do so. And then there'll be a conclusion at the end of it. So over to you. Let's start.
Sure. Thank you, Ajayji and Ahujaji, for opening remarks. And many thanks to other office bearers of IT80 bar, respected Mr. Sayali, Senior Advocate, and Mr. Sanjeev Chaudhary, a renowned chartered accountant, and my colleague, Tarandeep. So friends, the first decision which we are taking up today is the latest decision of Karnataka High Court in the case of Karnataka Cooperative Apex Bank Limited. The decision is important because it sort of impounds a new proposition that in case of 147 reassessment proceedings, a fresh claim can be raised by the assessee in the return of income filed in response to notice under section 148. So our endeavor would be today to see whether this decision lays down a correct proposition, and on that basis a new plea can be taken in the reassessment proceedings. Now to start with, first, what were the facts of this case? In this case, the return of income filed by the assessee bank was processed under section 143(1). And after the time limit was expired to issue notice under section 143(2), the return was not selected for scrutiny and the time limit to issue 143(2) stood expired. Notice under section 148 was issued, reopening assessment under section 147. Now, in return of income filed in response to that notice, the assessee bank raised a fresh claim which it missed in the original return, that was loss on securities. The AO did not allow it, CIT appeal allowed it, but tribunal did not allow. And now we have this High Court decision which has held that this claim was rightly taken by the assessee in the return filed in response to notice. And therefore, we are to yet discuss the ratio of this decision. Now, before I come to ratio of the decision, it would first be important to recapitulate the decision of Supreme Court in the case of Sun Engineering Works 198 ITR 297, which till date held field on this issue of a new claim to be raised in reassessment proceedings. The Supreme Court in that case held that when we read section 147, the scope of section 147 is restricted to assessment of income escaping assessment. And therefore, it is only the income that has escaped assessment can be reassessed under section 147. And while holding as above, the Supreme Court also examined the ratio of a earlier larger bench decision of the Supreme Court in the case of Jagmohan Rao, wherein in the context of whether an assessing officer is empowered to assess additional issues in reassessment proceedings, the Supreme Court had held that yes, in reassessment proceedings, the whole assessment is open and the assessing officer has power to touch upon issues more than the issues on which reasons were recorded. So now the issue came up whether when the whole assessment is open, a fresh claim can be raised in the reassessment proceedings or not. So after examining the ratio of Supreme Court in Jagmohan Rao, Supreme Court held that no, the decision of Supreme Court has to be understood in the proper context. We cannot pick up words from the decision of that Supreme Court. And when we read the decision in the proper context, it is only the under assessment which is reopened and concluded issues are not reopened in 147 proceedings. So the concluded issues remain closed that cannot be re-agitated by the assessee in the reassessment proceedings. The issues which have been under assessed by the assessing officer, they are whole open in the reassessment proceedings. So on that basis, the Supreme Court in case of Sun Engineering held that new claims cannot be raised or the concluded issues cannot be re-agitated in the reassessment proceedings. But simultaneously, the Supreme Court also held that 147 proceedings are for the benefit of revenue. The assessee is only entitled to raise a claim on or with respect to the issues which have been reopened by the assessing officer, but the returned income, the assessed income cannot go below the returned income. So this was sum and substance of the ratio of Supreme Court in case of Sun Engineering, which to my understanding held the field till date. Now the Karnataka High Court in this present case has sought to distinguish the decision of Sun Engineering on the ground that the decision of Sun Engineering was a case of reassessment after 143(3), whereas the present is a case of 143(1), that is intimation passed under section 143(1). The High Court holds that when the decision of Sun Engineering, the assessment year to which the decision of Sun Engineering applied, there was no concept of intimation under section 143(1). Even 143(1) was considered as an order, and therefore the ratio of that decision cannot be applied to the present legal position where 143(1) is considered as an intimation. And while holding as above, and therefore for that reason, Karnataka High Court has distinguished the decision of Supreme Court in Sun Engineering. While holding as above, the High Court also relied upon the decision of Supreme Court in Rajesh Jhaveri, where a distinction has been drawn between 143(1) versus 143(3) vis-a-vis reopening of either of the two proceedings under section 147. So this is one aspect of this Karnataka High Court decision. Secondly, without prejudice to the above, the High Court holds that even assuming 143(1) is an order, even then the fresh claim can be raised for the reason that when 147 is opened, the original assessment order is effaced. And therefore, if 143(1) is to be assumed as an order, under 147, the old order will stand effaced. And therefore, fresh claims can be raised in the reassessment proceedings. And for the purpose of holding as above, the High Court says that there was a larger bench decision of Jagmohan Rao, which was explained by Supreme Court in Sun Engineering. There is another later decision of Division Bench of Supreme Court in KL Srihari, 250 ITR 193, where while considering both the decision, Jagmohan Rao and Sun Engineering, the Supreme Court holds that the original assessment gets effaced and therefore fresh claims, concluded issues can be re-agitated in 147. And therefore Karnataka High Court prefers to follow this later decision of Supreme Court in KL Srihari. So, and on that basis, the High Court upholds the fresh claim raised by the SSC in the reassessment proceedings. So therefore, friends, this decision throws up many questions as to whether the decision of Supreme Court in Sun Engineering still holds good, whether it makes any difference as to when an assessment is completed under 143.1 or 143.3, and it is only in 143.1 situation a fresh claim can be raised. And how do we reconcile the decisions of Supreme Court in the case of Sun Engineering as also KL Srihari? So while our experts will deliberate and will throw light and conclude as to the validity of this decision, but before I throw open the floor to my experts, my prima facie view on the decision is that the distinction drawn by the High Court that Sun Engineering is a case of 143.3 versus 147 to my mind is not correct. Because when we will read the decision of Supreme Court in Sun Engineering, at paragraph 14, the Supreme Court specifically holds that in 147 covers both the cases of assessment and reassessment. And they also deal that the word assessment in 147 means when an assessment under section 147 is taken up for the first time. And even where the 147 is taken up for the first time, the scope of 147 is restricted to under assessment or income escaping assessment. So therefore, this distinction of 143.1, 143.3 to my mind already stands answered by Supreme Court in Sun Engineering. And then, friends, we have series of decisions from the Delhi High Court that when the time limit to issue notice under section 143.2 stands expired after 143.1, then the return of income stands concluded, and the return of income can be reopened only with respect to reasons recorded, or like in case of 153A on the basis of incriminating material. So we have this decision of Delhi High Court in Chintals 397 ITR 416, where in context of 153A, the Delhi High Court has specifically held that where the intimation is 143.1 and time limit to issue 143.2 is expired, the scope of reassessment under 153A is restricted to incriminating material and concluded issues cannot be reopened. To the same effect is the decision of Delhi High Court in PNB Finance 340 ITR 50, where in context of 14A, it was held that where 143.1 time limit has expired, the 14A issue cannot be re-agitated in 147 proceedings. The decision of Supreme Court in Rajesh Jhaveri is in a different context. It was that in 143.1, there is no opinion formed by the assessing officer, and therefore reassessment proceedings cannot be initiated under 147, and therefore this decision has been wrongly applied. Thirdly, the decision of Supreme Court in KL Srihari, to my mind, that was only dismissal of SLP. There is no exposition of law by the Supreme Court in that decision, and therefore we cannot read that decision as laying down any ratio. And for that reason, the decision of Supreme Court in Sun Engineering still holds field. That's second. And lastly, friends, Karnataka High Court has missed to see the later decision of Supreme Court in CIT versus Alagirindan Finance 293 ITR 1.
Vinod, आपकी आवाज आ रही है, Vinod? Okay. Yeah, go on, please.
Where this later decision of Supreme Court, which has not been noticed in this Karnataka High Court, therein in the context of 263, that is whether where in 260, there was earlier a 143.3 order, which was subsequently reassessed under 147. Then when a 263 notice is issued, what would be the time limit? Whether it would be governed from the date of order under section 143.3 or 147. The Supreme Court, after considering Jagmohan Rao and Sun Engineering, held that the issue which was not there in 147, then the original 143.3 stands, and if that is sought to be revised in 263 proceedings, time limit will be governed by 143.3 order. In other words, the 143.3 order still holds field and is not effaced by 147 order. So this decision of Supreme Court has not been considered in this Karnataka High Court decision. So for these multiple reasons, to my mind, we cannot take a position on the basis of Karnataka High Court that that a fresh claim can be raised in reassessment proceeding. That are my preliminary views. I'll now throw open the floor to experts of the day to give their views on this issue. Ajay ji, maybe you can.
Yeah. No, I am not going to give any view, but just to make two corrections. One, of course, your explanation is brilliant, but you said KL Srihari is a two-judge
Division,
decision.
yes.
It's a three-judge decision.
No, sir. It has been wrongly noted in the Karnataka High Court.
I see.
Yes,
Okay.
yes.
So Karnataka High Court, okay. So I stand corrected. It's a two-member because in the judgment it says so. Secondly, you also said that KL Srihari is a dismissal.
No, sir, my correction. My correction. Yes, it's a
KL
three-judge decision.
Srihari, three judges, S.C. Agarwal, Shagir Ahmed, and M. Srinivas.
Yes. My correction.
Oh, I see.
Yeah.
I see. And then
it's a dismissal of SLP. It's a dismissal.
No, it's not. It is not. It's by a speaking order, and dismissal of an SLP by a speaking order has a binding effect. So if you look at page 20, so page 20, they have given their opinion. Page 19 and page 20 of the order, they have given their view. I'll just leave it at this. Just these two correct observations.
Sir, okay. So just my one observation and then over to seniors. So when they are dismissing the SLP in the last line they have written, we do not consider it necessary to enter into the question that is raised and the same is left open. So
Absolutely.
they only give the decision on facts and leave the question open. So
Okay.
I'll leave it at that.
Yeah.
So I think probably Ajay, I will come in first because I'll leave
Yes.
the word to Mr. Siali for everything.
Most certainly.
He'll correct my mistakes also. So Mr. Siali will have the final word. Sir, I think I have the liberty of going first then, sir.
Please.
Thank you very much. So I think Gaurav, couple of points. I think if you look at the judgment which we talked about of V. Jagan Mohan Rao, the judgment came in 1969, right? That's point number one. Post that, there are Supreme Court judgments in Mewalal where they followed this. Sun Engineering, as you rightly said, discussed in detail the Jagmohan's decision and held that, as you rightly said, you can't read lines out of context. You have to look at the ratio. You have to look at everything. And that is where all of us felt, and rightly so, that Sun Engineering holds the fort. Now, when the matter reached the Supreme Court from the Karnataka High Court judgment in the case of Srihari, they were told very clearly, the bench was told very clearly that there is a three-judge judgment and there is a two-judge bench judgment in Sun Engineering. Difference of view. So they had to give their views considering both the views. Now, if you look at the last paragraph in the last 4 lines, last 5 lines, the last 2 lines, if I just go a just 5 lines before that, he says, on a consideration of the order dated 16th July 1987, we are satisfied the said assessment order, which was before them, makes a fresh assessment on the entire income of the respondent assessee, and the High Court was, in our opinion, right in proceeding on the basis that the earlier assessment order has been effaced by the subsequent order. But the court has very clearly held that the earlier assessment order has been effaced by the subsequent order. So this was the issue which was there in Jagmohan case also, saying that the earlier order gets effaced. Now, if these are the clear findings, in whichever context we read this, just go to the next page. Yeah, so if you read from here on a consideration, the last 5 after the word assessment order 147, these lines. Here they're saying that the earlier assessment order has been effaced by a subsequent order. In these circumstances, we do not consider it necessary to go into the question that is raised. So are they not trying to say that the earlier order having effaced, what is there left to answer? I mean, the one way to look at that, and I think that is where Mr. Siali can come in to say, how would you interpret this order? Because Sun Engineering is a very detailed order going point by point into what is 147, what is assessment, reassessment, what is left. 147 is for the benefit of the revenue, etc. So I think it is a 3-judge bench order. It is very correctly observed as we were looking at yesterday also. So Karnataka High Court has raised a point saying if 143(1) is an intimation, and obviously if you look at the other orders, Delhi High Court order, which you looked at Chintal's case, where they said if the time limit is gone, and there is a board circular also saying that if the time limit is gone to issue a 143(2) notice, then that 143(1) intimation is deemed to be an order, because it cannot be that there is nothing left thereafter. So you can't issue a 143(2) if you have to issue a 147, you can issue a 147 after satisfying the conditions. Yes, it throws a new issue, but my question is that if you look at the order of 2007 again, which you referred to in the case of Lingandran Finance, CIT versus Lingandran Finance, Supreme Court, they have followed, Sun Engineering in a way, after considering both. But if you look at this order of the Supreme Court, which is in 2007, much after, this case which is before us, they have again followed Sun Engineering. It is again a Debian bench. So is it that the 3-bench order which is in between, which is trying to hold this view or give this view, doesn't hold any field at all? I think I stop here and let Mr. Siali, give us a guidance as to what is it which survives thereafter now. So whether Karnataka High Court is right or not, then I think we'll get answered automatically. I think over to Sir now.
Let me attempt an answer. Actually, can you remove this from the screen, please?
Sure.
KL Srihari, Supreme Court. Thank you. In order to appreciate what does KL Srihari says, we have to first see the decision of the High Court against which the matter came before the Supreme Court. Do we have that decision, Tarandeep? That's 197 ITR, page 694. Do we have it?
I'll just open it.
I
on the
have,
screen.
Taran.
Yeah, it's a
Gaurav,
brief
if you can-
judgment.
Gaurav,
Yeah,
you
please,
can- Gaurav, you
yeah.
can open it.
Put it up because
Yeah.
that will give you the answer
Yes.
that there is absolutely no conflict on this. If we look at Rajendra Babu's order,
Yes, sir.
as he then was, because he later came to Supreme Court, he was a thorough taxman. Now, if we see that order, please see the contention. The contention raised on behalf of the appellants, yes, this one. The contention raised on behalf of the appellants is that interest under section 139(8) and 215, delay in filing of the return and advance tax, though not leviable in reassessment under section 147 of the Act, the respondent is liable to pay interest levied under the original assessment. So they said, although that order doesn't survive, yet you are liable to pay interest at whatever was to be levied under that order. This contention is plainly untenable in view of the decision of the Mysore Iron and Steel 157 ITR 531. In that case, after making a review of the case law, this court considered the question as to the effect of reopening an assessment and held that the original assessment gets totally effaced in that event. When there is a total effacement of the original assessment order, it is impossible to understand the contention raised and how the interest levied there under still survives. Now, what happens here is, when we are talking about delay in filing of the return, or we are filing of the advance tax not having been paid, then we compare it with the end figure, the assessed figure. When we compare there, then it is the figure which comes up in the assessment which survives as on date. You can't take it piecemeal, that we'll take it under the original 143.3 or 143.1 order, and we will take the balance under the 147 read with 143.3 or whatever. So what they said here, now let's go to the Supreme Court decision. The Supreme Court says that we have heard what was just read out. Can you put it on?
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. Yes, sir. Just keep.
Yes,
Is it
we
visible?
have heard Shri Ranbir Chandra, paragraph 2, learned counsel appearing for the petitioners, and Shri Harish Salve, learned senior counsel appearing for the respondent. We have also perused the original assessment order dated 19th March 83, as well as the subsequent assessment order that was passed on July 87, after the reopening of the assessment under section 147. On a consideration of the order dated July 16, 1987, that is the reassessment order, we are satisfied that the said assessment order makes a fresh assessment of the entire income of the respondent assessee. What really happened there was that whatever was the subject matter of original assessment was also the subject matter of reassessment. It was probably the information was that what has been given is incorrect. So therefore, they said the entire original order and the reassessment order takes into account the entire income of the respondent assessee, and the High Court was, in our opinion, right in proceeding on the basis that the earlier assessment order has been effaced by the subsequent order. It is only in that context. It is not entire effacement that has taken place. They have not overridden or overruled Sun. They have not overruled Jagmohan Rao, and they have not overruled that decision of Alagendram. They've not overruled that. That has held the field. And why should we get into all these wordings and all these, observations? We have to first see the basic principles. What are the basic principles? The basic principle is that whenever action is taken under 147, it is to assess the escaped income. Maybe the first time, maybe the second time. Assessment includes 143(1) also, and it includes the 143(3) also. So when the 147 action takes place, it is with the avowed object of bringing to tax the escaped income. If the escaped income is what is aimed at, you cannot exceed, you cannot bypass, you cannot surpass or override the other income which has already been accepted and which cannot be the subject matter of escaped income. Now, of course, there is a proviso, or there is a, I think, expansion of jurisdiction under 147, that even when the EO has reopened on a ground and he finds that there are other grounds also which are escaped income, then he can go to that also. But that doesn't mean he can actually take up any and every ground for that matter. In fact, we have that the Delhi High Court on this, and even the Bombay High Court is there. But let's not get into that mess. I'm talking about first principles. On first principles, reassessment is aimed at assessing the escaped income. And that is what Jagmohan Rao says. That is what, can you kindly put Jagmohan Rao on the screen, please?
Yeah.
Yes. Jagmohan Rao talks about this at page, I've got the Supreme Court cases here, at paragraph 4, 394 page. The first question. Yes, please go back a little. The first question. This is where the paragraph starts. The first question. A little, yes. Now please come down. We go to the words, it was stated on behalf of the appellant. Niche aa jaiye. Or niche. Or niche. It was stated.
Yes.
Yes. It was stated on behalf of the appellant that in any case, the income tax officer could have legitimately assessed 1/3 share of the income which was due to the assessee according to the judgment of the Madras High Court. And there was escape only to the extent of 2/3 share income. This argument is not of much avail to the appellant, because once proceedings under 34 are taken to be validly initiated with regard to the 2/3 of the share income, the jurisdiction of the assessing officer cannot be confined only to that portion. Section 34 in turn states that once the income tax officer decides to reopen, he could do so within the period prescribed by serving on the person liable to tax a notice containing all or any of the requirements which may be included in a notice under section 22(2) and may proceed to assess, that means whether it is 143(1), or reassess, that means whether it is 143(3), such income, profits or gains. It is therefore manifest that once the assessment is reopened by issuing a notice under subsection 2 of section 22, the previous under assessment is set aside and the whole assessment proceedings start afresh. Now, where do they lay down the caveat? In the very next line. When once valid proceedings are started under 34(1)(b), which is 147(b) of the B, the income tax officer has not only the jurisdiction, but it was his duty to levy tax on the entire income that has escaped assessment during the year. So it is not any and every income. It is only that income which has escaped assessment during the year. Now let us go from here to Sun Engineering. Sun Engineering, I have again the paragraph starting with, however, to read the judgment of Jagan Mohan Rao.
Para 32.
Para 32. No, these are the divergent views. Come down, please. However, to read.
24.
I'll go to the इससे पहले वाला पैराग्राफ जो है वो भी ले सकते हैं. Para 39.
This is para 39, sir.
Yes, para 39.
Yeah.
Now this is important. Kindly see. It starts with the principle laid down by this judgment, because this is the entire thing. Okay, it will be clearer in fact. The principle laid down by this court in Jagmohan Rao, therefore, is only to the extent that once an assessment is validly reopened. Should I read or not?
Yes, sir, please.
Please, sir. Please, sir.
The principle laid down by this court in Jagmohan Rao's case, therefore, is only to the extent that once an assessment is validly reopened by issuance of notice under 22(2), corresponding to section 148, the previous under assessment is set aside and the ITO has jurisdiction and duty to levy tax on the entire income that has escaped income. You see, this is, I had just highlighted and emphasized on those words. The Supreme Court in Sun Engineering is also emphasizing those very words. That entire escaped income during the previous year. What is set aside is thus only the previous under assessment and not the original assessment proceedings. An order made in relation to escaped turnover does not affect the operative force of the original assessment, particularly if it has acquired finality, and the original order retains both its character and identity. It is thus only in cases of under assessment based on clauses A to D of clause 1 of 147 that the assessment of tax has to be recomputed on the entire taxable income. The judgment of Jagmohan Rao cannot be read to imply as laying down that in the reassessment proceedings validly initiated, the assessee can seek reopening of the whole assessment and claim credit in respect of items finally concluded in the original assessment. The assessee cannot claim recomputation of income or the redoing of an assessment and be allowed a claim which he either failed to make or which was otherwise rejected at the time of original assessment, which has attained finality. Of course, in the reassessment proceedings, it is open to an assessee to show that income alleged to have escaped assessment has in truth and in fact not escaped assessment, but that the same has been shown under some inappropriate head in the original return. but to read the judgment of Jagmohan Rao as if laying down that the reassessment wipes out the entire assessment, and that reassessment is not only confined to escaped assessment or under assessment, but to the entire assessment for the year, and start assessment proceedings de novo, giving right to an assessee to re-agitate matters which he had lost during the original assessment proceedings, which had acquired finality, is not only erroneous, but also against the phraseology of Section 147 and the object of reassessment proceedings. Such an interpretation would be reading down the judgment totally out of context in which the questions arose for the decision in that case. This is very important, because what happens, if any decision, whether be it of High Court or be it of Supreme Court, it has to be seen in the context of what is being decided there. You cannot pick and choose and apply that decision in rem to everything and anything without any heed to the context in which it has been laid down. That is the reason why it is always said that decisions of any court are not scriptural absolutes, but they are relative reasonings. What is a relative reasoning? A reasoning which relates to the context. Now, please see, it is neither desirable nor permissible, I'm reading again, to pick out a word or a sentence from the judgment of this court, divorced from the context of the question under consideration, and treat it to be the complete law declared by the court. So after this, now let's see where these words have been mellowed down. Before I do that, the Allegram a la Gendron's case, that is also a very detailed case, 293 ITR, page 1. You have that?
Yes,
Gaurav?
yes, yeah.
ये भी दे दो, इसका पैराग्राफ जो है, पैरा 7. Yes, this is where it starts. No, we need not read the entire thing. They recount what is stated in Sun Engineering in very detail, and then Jagmohan Rao in para 9. Then in para 10, please see this now. There may not be any doubt or dispute that once an order of assessment is reopened, the previous under assessment will be held to be set aside, and the whole proceeding would start afresh. But the same would not mean that even when the subject matter of reassessment is distinct and different, the entire proceeding of the assessment would be deemed to have been reopened. Similarly, then they have said this at paragraph 12 again. I need not take up your time. And again in paragraph 14, that was a case of Madras High Court vis-a-vis the Wealth Tax Act. There's one more case which I would like to refer to, which I'm sure may not be there with you people, but you may just note down the citation. That is the case of Dalbir Singh versus State, 1979, 3 SCC 745. What is the importance of this decision? It's very interesting. In fact, you people will be able to use this in several other cases which you argue before the courts. Dalbir Singh stipulates, what is the ratio decidendi of a case? What happens? There are facts. There is the law. You apply that law to the facts. This says that when that law is applied to those facts, that is not the ratio decidendi. That is inter partes binding between the parties who are fighting that case. But the law that they apply is the ratio decidendi. Now, what is the law which has been decided in these cases? I can tell you what paragraph is in there in Dalbir Singh's case. Paragraph 22 is relevant. According to the well-settled theory of precedents, every decision contains three basic ingredients: findings of material, direct inferential, statement of principles of law applicable, and judgment based on it. That is the combined effect of 1 and 2. Now they say, for the purpose of parties themselves and their privies, ingredient 3, that is application of law to those facts, is the material element in the decision, for it determines finally their rights and liabilities in relation to the subject matter. It is the judgment that stops the parties from reopening the dispute. However, for the purpose of the doctrine of precedents, ingredient 2 is the vital element of the decision. This indeed is the ratio decidendi. So now what is the ratio decidendi? वो 143 1 था, ये 143 3 है. वहां पे FS हो गया, वहां पे factually नहीं हुआ, वहां पे सब कुछ absorb हो गया, यहाँ पे सब कुछ absorb नहीं. These are all irrelevant. The ratio is that you are restricted to the reassessment and you are restricted to the escaped income and nothing else.
Sir, if I may.
Yeah.
Sir, of course, brilliant as always, and I think that may eventually be the correct view. I was only wondering, suppose we had said, Siali Saab, there's 1 crore of rupees as fee. Would you argue otherwise? I mean, but I don't. But it's okay. But I'm sure you would. 1 crore is not the incentive, depending
I
on.
think in that case, what Sanjeev has said, I'm sorry, Sanjeev, I still address you as Sanjeev.
No, absolutely, sir. Absolutely.
Then what Sanjeev has said is the right approach. Please give him that 1 crore.
Achha, sir, now I have a point. You see, if we look at Sun Engineering, they say finally the assessment which has been concluded, it has achieved finality, and therefore you will assess under 147 only in respect of the underassessed income.
Yeah, may I attempt that before you formulate your question? Because this is what the Karnataka High Court has also emphasized.
Yes.
What is the distinction that they draw between 143.1 and 143.3 is that in one there is no order, in the other there is an order.
नहीं, मैं वो नहीं कह रहा. मैं उस वाली गल से बिल्कुल नहीं उससे कह रहा. मैं तो खाली सिंपल एक चीज कह रहा हूं. You see, the issue before Sun Engineering was on what are the powers of the assessing officer when they are making a reassessment. And they said the powers are that they cannot go beyond the reassessment, beyond the escaped income. That is what they said. You cannot. But they went a step further to say that these are proceedings which belong to the department and not to the assessing. But here is where I would say that it needs a relook, particularly after Srihari and the Karnataka High Court judgment, because they don't talk. What about a legitimate claim of an assessee? A legal claim of an assessee. What they talk of is vis-a-vis the department. They don't talk vis-a-vis the assessee. If there's a legally allowable, admissible claim which has escaped one way or the other, and there's an assessment which has come up for assessing your correct total overall income. It repeatedly says assessment of your total overall income. That is where I think the advantage of Srihari needs to be taken, to say from the assessee's point of view that here is a case assessees. Again, I'm not stepping into what the department's power is, but as far as the assessee's power is, legitimate claims can be, because the original assessment doesn't stand when 147 comes in, and therefore they ought to be admitted. I'll just give you another example. The 153A is to be restricted to the evidence found in the course of search. However, the same Bombay High Court says that in a 153A, you can make a fresh claim. Same, under the same breath, saying the same thing. So what I'm only trying to say, sir, is, do you think there is a scope of the kind of argument which I'm just facing? When, see, after all, we have this judgment of the Karnataka High Court, which is in its own way a reasoned judgment. They have taken into account all decisions, possible decisions under the sun, and decided with application of mind. And that is the latest judgment. And they have also brought in Srihari, which Srihari incidentally has not been considered in many other judgments which we have referred to just now. थोड़ी hope है कि नहीं है? नहीं है तो सर आगे चलिए. है तो थोड़ा.
I don't think so.
I'll just add 1 point to Ajay's question, sir. There's a board circular also which says that the assessing officer has to compute the income of the assessee.
Absolutely.
Now, if I have not made one claim which is correctly due to me, and I think just adding to Ajay's point, that isn't there a possibility that when the reassessment has started, one is that the reassessment hasn't started, time has elapsed, I'm sitting quiet, everything is quiet. But once the reassessment has started, the issues are before the assessing officer, and I bring it to his notice that there is a claim which I did not make. And as the board circular, which till date has not been withdrawn, says that it is the responsibility of the assessing officer also to compute the income correctly. Is there a possibility, as Ajay is saying, to bring that claim because there is a board circular saying there is a claim and the AO has to follow it?
And these decisions, and Sri Hari and others. And Sri Hari.
There is a parity of thinking between both of you. And that is not an erroneous approach. That there should be justice, and not only justice, but substantial justice. Both the department should be fair and honest in whatever they do. However, that doesn't mean you can substitute one proceeding for the other. The question is there a fora, is there a mechanism available to you to redress once the assessment is over and you have found that you have missed the bus? There certainly is. You may go under 264, you may file 1001 petitions. The Supreme Court may also give you relief on that, on several counts, so long as the facts are on record. But to use a particular mechanism which is meant for a particular purpose on account of substantial justice and fairness may not be the correct approach. So therefore, and that's why if you see, KL Sri Hari is not laying down any rule whatsoever. As I pointed out, they say whatever was the original income, that is already included in the reassessed income. So therefore, in effect, there will be no difference in 139.8 interest or 215 interest. So why should we get into this? So we are leaving this question open and we are not adjudicating thereon. So KL Sri Hari is not laying down a ratio which Sun and which the other decision has laid down. So therefore, there is no overturning of that decision. That still holds the field. But yes, I can give you another example. There is, without of course naming the case and without naming anybody in the process, there is a case where an entirely incorrect approach has been taken before the AO. On the admitted facts, the correct approach would have given them 100% relief, which they were claiming, but under a wrong process. Now we have gone to the High Court, we have gone to the Supreme Court, and we have got directions. Because Supreme Court has even gone on to the extent of saying that, let's say today, I am saying this income is accessible in the hands of HUF and the department says, no, sorry, individual, or vice versa. And I have paid taxes as an individual. Tomorrow, ultimately, it is held that it is taxable in the hands of the HUF. What happens to those taxes? The Supreme Court says, sorry, be fair, do substantial justice, give them the credit for those taxes. So substantial justice and fairness are not to be compromised. We only have to be careful as to the modus operandi that we follow to achieve.
Understood.
Any other question? Should we go on to the?
Sir, I think आगे चल रहे हैं sir. Towards the end, because already we are at 4:27. हाले एक issue है. There are people on the chat. They have already raised about 5-6 questions on the same issue. But I think आगे चल रही है तो better है नहीं. Or would you like to look at this? No, I think आगे चल रहे हैं sir. Let's go further. Let's move on to the next question, and we'll take this up.
You know,
we are just an hour left now.
Now going further, the second judgment is Vama Sundari's case of Madras High Court.
There's nothing Sundari about it.
There's nothing Sundari about it, sir. So why there's nothing Sundari is that, okay, I'll just give the brief facts of this case first. The subject matter of challenge in this case was the 140 assumption of jurisdiction under 147. So SSC had challenged the 148 notice itself before the High Court. The reassessment proceedings were pending. That 148 notice was issued in the hands of the amalgamating company, and by that time amalgamation had taken place and the resulting company was already into existence. So SSC challenged in a writ that 148 has been issued in name of a dead person, and on merits also they challenged the reassessment proceedings. As far as assumption of jurisdiction on a dead person, revenue rebutted by relying upon provisions of section 170, which found merit before the Honorable High Court of Madras, and they held that mere service of notice in respect of a company which was not existing cannot be a ground to a sale proceeding instituted for reopening of assessment. Now, the issue rises that the judgment of Madras High Court is completely silent as to how, after the judgment of Maruti Suzuki, which is 416 ITR 613 Supreme Court, this particular judgment of Supreme Court has neither been cited, it appears has not been cited or has not been considered.
I'm sure it must have been cited, Tarun. The only thing is that probably the judge has not taken it into account.
Yes, so the judge has not taken a note of that. And therefore, so the Supreme Court has very clearly held in Maruti's case, they have, before I come to Supreme Court, there were 3 judgments of Delhi High Court, which is Spice Entertainment, Micra India, and Dimension Apparel. Just in crux, the ratio which was laid down by Delhi High Court, which has been upheld by Supreme Court, is that it is incumbent upon the income tax authority to substitute the correct person. They can't frame an assessment on the dead person, and a mere participation will not give, will not be an will not. There is no estoppel against the law. Framing an assessment in a wrong name is not an irregularity; it is an illegality which cannot be cured under 292B. In Micra's case, the High Court further went and examined Section 170, which was used by the Madras High Court, and they held that 170, even after 170, you have to still make the assessment in the hands of the correct person, and 170 cannot help the department. Supreme Court in Maruti's case has upheld the ratio laid down by these 3 judgments and then decided in favor. I must say that before Supreme Court, both notice under 143(2) and the final assessment was made in the hands of the amalgamating company, whereas in the case of Sundri's case, Bama Sundri's case, SSC had only challenged the notice. There are several judgments post Maruti which are in favor of the SSC, like Genpact, Gayatri Micron, eMudra, and Teleperformance. But however, Madras High Court has still not agreed with Delhi High Court, even after Supreme Court. In 2 recent judgments of Madras High Court, which are Tara Chandthini, which is reported in 2020, 118 taxman.com 252, and Oasis Green, which is reported in 426 ITR 124. They have again not followed Maruti's judgment, and the reason given by them is that in Maruti's judgment, SSC had intimated the assessing officer the factum of amalgamation, whereas in these 2 judgments, the SSC probably acted truant, and he never informed the assessing officer that there has been an amalgamation. However, now recently, the Honorable Delhi High Court, again, this issue has cropped up. There is a controversy even post Maruti's judgment at Delhi High Court stage. In a recent judgment of Sony, by an order dated 18th May 2021, the honorable judges, one of the honorable judges before Delhi High Court, wanted to frame substantial question of law even after Maruti's judgment. The second honorable judge said there is no substantial question of law. But since it was only at admission stage, they said, let us frame the question of law. And what weighed with the dissenting judge who was reluctant to follow Delhi High Court judgment was, he accepted the argument of the department in Sony's case, which was, the fact specific was, till the issuance of notice under 143(2), the name of SSC had not changed. Notice on correct name, and thereafter, even if the name of SSC incorrectly mentioned in assessment order is a curable defect. This is what made with the Delhi High Court as recent as 2 months back, and they have authorized the question of law. From Delhi High Court website, it appears that on 23rd of August, some hearing has taken place, and they have deferred the matter now to February 2022. So this is the position, and the issues which
no hearing has taken place. They have only deferred the matter, saying that there is a video hearing today fixed for hearing, but there is no time. Okay. So they've deferred.
Okay. Now, the issues which I have submit before the seniors over here is that, is the judgment of Bama Sundri correct? Which, according to me, it's not correct. Apparently, it is not correct because it goes categorically against the Supreme Court judgment. after Supreme Court, the second is after Supreme Court judgment, is it still the irregularity or illegality issue, is it still open for any debate when an assessment is framed in name of a dead person? Does section 170 or 176 support the case of revenue? Now, Madras High Court has made an issue that SSC had never intimated of the factum of amalgamation. Is it a relevant distinction which has been made? And lastly, sir, which is a very relevant thing, which I would like to specifically raise an example. What happens in a case that 143(2) is issued in the name of the amalgamating company, which was in existence when that notice was issued, but subsequently when the assessment is framed, by that time amalgamation takes place, and let's take two scenarios. The assessment is framed in the name of amalgamated company and is framed in the name of amalgamating company. And in both the cases, there is no fresh 143(2) issue. Can the SSC make an issue out of that? And lastly, another example, that when an assessment is taking place, SSC takes the refund in the name of amalgamating company, but finally challenges the final assessment order that it is in the name of amalgamated company. So can the department realize that now again you are playing to it? These are the various issues which I would like the seniors to probably throw some light on. So Chaudhary Sahab, starting with you first.
Taran, a question yaad rakhi, ek karke puchi, you have just gone on. I hope you have noted them down. Because every question we will.
Just 1 second, Sanjeev. I have seen those messages which have come in the meantime. All those messages impinge on what Ajay, you were saying about fairness, equity being emphasized, whether we should go under 264, whether 147 is the only route. I think all these questions already are answered.
Yeah.
Somebody has referred to Chalet Products to say that does that help? Chalet Products was actually a totally different case. I still remember it during its Indore days. I had argued that matter. At that time, I was in Besh Associates, and I had argued that matter. That really would not help. That is a case where, admittedly, the assessment order has become bad in law, and the question was whether the taxes can be taken back by the SSC or not. Anyway, now please go ahead. I'm sorry, Sanjeev.
So I think Tarandeep has, fired about 7-8 substantial questions, which needs to be remembered and responded to. So thanks, Taran, for those questions. But I think as Syali Sahab had initially said, there is nothing Sundari about Mama Sundari. So actually, when I look at the judgment, honestly, I fail to understand one thing as to when the SSC sir went to the High Court, when the notice was issued. Why did the High Court not say that follow GK and go back? You are too early here. They should have thrown it out at that stage itself. That's one point which came to my mind when I read the order. I mean, GKN very clearly says the notice is issued. Give your objections. They should be disposed of. Why are you here? And sir, you would recall there are a number of cases when I used to come to you regularly. That was the process we followed in every case, that please give your objections. Otherwise, you're too early. You'll be thrown out of the High Court. So I don't know why the judge did not take that as a plea number one. The reasoning which the judgment gives is that the address of the SSC, that the amalgamating company and the amalgamated company is the same, and you have responded to the notice. And I don't think those reasons, in my view, as Karan also said, are good enough to, not hold it otherwise. And as I think Syali Sahab responded back by saying, I'm sure the other judgments would have been presented, but they don't find mention in the order. So we are just reading the order as it is. So probably this order, with due respect, probably suffers from those issues as well. But having said that, obviously the first answer is, Karan, that maybe the judgment doesn't hold or is not correctly, interpreting the law which it should have been, number one. Number two, you refer to another judgment of the High Court in the case of Oasis Green Tech Private Limited, again Madras High Court, a judgment delivered in January 20, whereas the Vamasundari's case is of April 21. Now that judgment also is against the SSC, sir. But there the judge at least has analyzed the law. She has looked at Maruti. She has looked at Spice. She has looked at everything. But
she was a tax person.
Yeah, absolutely. And sir, then she looks at it and says, the differentiating factor is that you've not intimated the assessing officer, as is in the case of Maruti. And also you have, taken the refunds, and probably somewhere else you have filed one more return, as if giving an impression that the amalgamating company is still there. I think Taran raised one point. Is the intimation required? Is the intimation to the assessing officer to be given? And I think, sir, each amalgamation, there is a public notice. There is a code, there is a notices in the newspapers. The department is supposed to respond. So I think the point which you made on the intimation to be given to the assessing officer, in my view, may not hold good, because there is a public notice given to everyone, and the department is supposed to respond. So this January 20 judgment of the Madras High Court is again, differentiating and trying to interpret the law differently, again, probably is an issue. Now, if you look at Spice Entertainment, they've very clearly said on a 143(2) notice, and I think you raised a point that if the notice is issued at the time when the amalgamating company was still in existence, I think the notice will have to be issued in the name of the amalgamating company, because the company is in existence at that point. It is not amalgamated so far. It gets amalgamated at a later point of time, but with a retrospective date. And if it is amalgamated from a retrospective date, that notice probably is correctly issued, because on that day, the amalgamating company was in existence and the amalgamation had not been approved by the High Court. Now, having said that, when it is approved, there's another question which you posed: should you issue another notice? And if the assessment is done in the hands of the amalgamated company later on, will it hold good? Now, that is a technical matter, and I think that there may still be a view to say that another 143(2) notice should be issued or not be issued. Maybe still a 292 may come in. But otherwise, I think there are enough and more judgments of the courts to say that a 292B cannot cure this effect. It is an illegality, because one can go into the various judgments which are there. I think all judgments are saying you can't issue a notice to a dead person. You can't pass an order against a dead person. The company is not in existence. It is a judicial person. Once it is amalgamated, the name is struck off, etc., etc. So there are various positions taken and explained as to why an assessment order cannot be passed in the hand in the name of a company which stands amalgamated. And I think another point which you made is that what happens to a now, at times what happens is the refund which is issued to me, I take over all the assets and liabilities of the company. So what is an amalgamation? Amalgamation is when a company, broadly speaking, A company merges into B company, and the B company takes over all the assets, liabilities, claims. I'll be liable to pay the tax demands also at a later point of time. I'm entitled to the refunds also. So is there harm that if a refund comes in the name of the amalgamating company, and I go to my bankers and say, look, because of this court order, I am now responsible for all the claims and the refunds of the amalgamating company, and please credit this to my account, and they credit it. I don't think that will be a huge factor to say that, look, you deposited the refund which was issued to the amalgamating company, as if you are accepting the fact that the amalgamating company is in existence. No, I think it is an operation of law that the name is struck off. It doesn't exist. Now, because of the High Court order, which kind of, blesses the scheme of an amalgamation, I'm entitled to a refund of the amalgamating company to be deposited in my bank account. So I don't think that should be a determining factor to say that it will be held against the assessee. I think on 170 and 176, where you're talking about a succession of business, I think there the points was that if you can't find the predecessor, then you look at the successor. Now, if the company is liquidated, it is struck off, you can never find the company. So if you look at the Delhi High Court judgment, which is the later one, they have looked at all these sections to say, well, these will not come to the rescue of the department. So they have dealt with 170 and 176 also, and that is what the Delhi High Court has held. I think it was really nice reading the judgment in the case of Sony, where the two judges have given their viewpoints. And the dissenting judge, which holds the view that Maruti's case clearly and squarely applies to the facts of the case and the legal interpretation, he is of the view that the department does not have a case. I mean, Sony's case is quite complicated because there is a change of one name to the second name to the third name. There is a court order, etc., etc. But in the end, I think the first judge, he wrote the judgment. He says, well, there is a one reason on which you can differentiate, and that factor needs to be looked into. And that is where I think the question has not been framed and it is before the judges to be looked into again. But I think I would agree more with the reasoning of the second judge, which has brought about as to why the law declared by the Supreme Court in the case of Maruti still holds good, is correctly applicable to the facts of the case. And an order passed in the case of the amalgamating company will not hold good because the amalgamating company does not exist. That's what my submission is. And
Sir, before you come in, sir, just half a minute. I mean, I'm not going to, I quite agree with Sanjeev on all four. Perhaps the issue broadly would be to be discussed is whether it's an irregularity or an illegality, jurisdiction or no jurisdiction. That is one. Secondly, sir, maybe in the mind of the judge, as far as an amalgamating company getting amalgamated into an amalgamated company is concerned, vis-a-vis a dead human being. You know, when a person dies, his soul rests in God. But when a company gets amalgamated, the soul perhaps transfers to the amalgamated company. So the person, to the extent of his assets and liabilities, remains in the amalgamated company. Maybe for this reason alone, he would have thought that there is a continuum. It is only an irregularity. The assessing officer is not omniscient and omnipresent. A small newspaper cutting may not be enough. He may not, assessing officer may not be going through a vernacular newspaper in Punjab, sitting in Chennai to see whether it has been amalgamated or not. Intimation has not been given, should have been the responsibility of the assessing officer. In any case, even if it was done on the amalgamated company, the tax liability of the amalgamating company should have been paid by the amalgamated company. Would have been, even if that irregularity was not there. So with these factors, perhaps equity would have come into his mind. This is my view. I'll leave it to this. But yes, there is nothing great about this judgment.
Just to say one more thing, sir.
Yeah.
When it comes to a notice under section 156 issued in the name of amalgamating company, that department can enforce against the amalgamated company without being informed that there is an amalgamation. But when it comes to assessment, we need to inform them.
Arun, this is not the right. Let Mr. Syali answer.
So
I just have to say one point, sir. I think the point which you raised, Ajay, the judge records it in his order at page 6. He says, we inquired from the counsel for the respondent assessee, what was the prejudice suffered by the respondent assessee from the assessment order being in the wrong name? So what's wrong? Because they actually filed a petition also in the name of an amalgamating company's name. And he says, if you did that, what's wrong with it? But his answer was, look, the matter is covered under Maruti. They have addressed all the issues, and that's my answer. And nothing else. But I think that let Mr. Syali respond.
Hanji sir, last word for you.
I think this is a self-created problem which has resulted in this dissect, which has resulted in one high court adopting one view, another high court adopting another. You see, as Ajay, you rightly pointed out, what is the core question here? The core issue is whether having passed an assessment order in the name of a company which is no more in existence, which has been struck off the register, which the Supreme Court in Saraswati says is no more in existence, it is dead. Then whether that is an illegality or that is an irregularity. That is the only question that should have been answered. Now, very unfortunately, in Maruti's case, they hold it is an illegality. They hold it is bad in law. But when it comes to discussing another decision of Delhi High Court against which SLP has been dismissed by the Supreme Court, they go into the facts and say, no, that is different and this is different. They could easily have said that if it is invalid, it is illegal, then we don't have to go any further because the Supreme Court, not in one, but in maybe 200 decisions have said, and we've cited all those decisions with reference to 144C, where instead of issuing a draft order, they passed a final order. That once he makes that order and it is void, then there is no outcome of that order. There is no effect of that order. That order is basically a non-existent order. And therefore, its effect, its fallout have all to be ignored. We don't have to justify this on any facts. It's bad in law, it's bad in law. अब उसमें चाहे 144C जो उसने final order किया है, that may be having a lot of strength. That prima facie may show that it's a very valid order. There is a search against the party. They've recovered all kinds of material, but he has done this. So we need not go into the merits of the case at all. The very fact that in Maruti, the judges have gone into the facts of the case to distinguish that case of Skylight, I think.
Yes, sir.
That is where the entire problem came in. That is from that the Madras High Court gets its jurisdiction to say whether Maruti applies on all fours to every case or we have to analyze the facts of it. This is where the problem has come. Ab yahan pe all these questions are arising, whether it should be before, whether I should have informed, whether a 143.2 or they should, all this is actually irrelevant. Let's read that Maruti for a moment. Can you please put that
Yes,
on
sir,
screen?
Yes, sir.
You have the 107 taxman wala?
Yes, yes, sir. Just give me a minute, sir. I think.
Yeah.
Gaurav, you have हमारे वहाँ से screen sharing off हो रही है?
Yes, it's off.
And mind you, it's an order by a very learned judge. Very, very learned judge.
बाकी जजेस कम लर्नेड होते हैं सर?
नहीं, ऐसी बात नहीं है. अब जैसे एक जज को आपने फैमिली का जज कहा है, अब वो
हाँ,
मैंने तो नहीं कहा था ना. I think आपका जवाब मिल गया.
I thought you would have forgotten that part.
No, I'm not.
You asked for it.
I think it should be visible on the screen, sir. Now.
Yeah, it is there.
Yeah, okay, 107 tax. Now let's go to the decision straight away. We can leave out the facts of the case. We can leave out the contentions recorded, wherein all those decisions you are mentioning are also recorded, that later on the decisions have all taken the same view. Let us go to his conclusions. Now, please come to paragraph 12. 12. Once it is found. Oh, there are different paragraphs here. Paragraph 20. Paragraph 20. In Spice, yes, this one. Now, here, please come down a little. There is a paragraph 12 which is reproduced there. Yes, this is it. This is it. Once it is found that the assessment is framed in the name of a non-existing entity, it does not remain a procedural irregularity of the nature which could be cured by invoking the provisions. Following the decision of Spice Entertainment, this is what was held and which was upheld. Then they refer to Dimension Apparels, they refer to Micron Steels, Micra India, and then kindly come to para 27. This is where they start analyzing the facts of that. The submission, however, which has been urged on behalf of the revenue is that a contrary position emerges from the decision of the Delhi High Court in Skylight Hospitality LLP, which was affirmed on 6th April by a two-judge bench of this court, consisting of Honorable Shri Sikri and Honorable Shri Bhushan. Skylight Hospitality, so and so. In assessing the merits of the above submission, it is necessary to extract the order dated 6th April 2018. And in that they say, in the peculiar facts of this case, we are convinced that wrong name given in the notice was merely a clerical error which could be corrected under 292B of the Income Tax Act. SLP is dismissed. Now it is evident. Now please see their observations. Now it is evident from the above extract that it was in the peculiar facts of the case that this court indicated its agreement that a wrong name given in the notice was merely a clerical error capable of being corrected in 292. The peculiar facts of Skylight Hospitality emerge from the decision of the Delhi High Court. Skylight Hospitality, an LLP, had taken over on 13th May 2016 and acquired the rights and liabilities of Skylight Hospitality upon conversion under LLP Act 2008. It instituted a writ proceeding for challenging a notice under 147, dated 30th March 17. The reason to believe made a reference to the tax evasion report received from the investigation wing. The facts were ascertained by the investigation wing. Reasons to believe referred to the assessment order for 1314 and findings recorded in it. Though the notice under 147 was issued in the name of Skylight, there was, as Delhi High Court held, substantial and affirmative material and evidence on record to show that the issuance of notice in the name of the dissolved company was a mistake. The tax evasion report adverted to the conversion of the private limited company into an LLP. I just pause here for a moment. If this was weighing with the Honorable Supreme Court to say that it was mentioned in the investigation report that both of them were there, that means the company that merged and the company that survived, then how is it different from a case where you have yourself indicated to the assessing officer that this is the company which has merged into this company and this is the surviving company, so you can't assess the company which has already merged. How are the facts different? The tax evasion report adverted to the conversion, which we have ourselves informed in some cases. Moreover, the reasons to believe recorded by the assessing officer adverted to the approval of the principal commissioner. How does that make a difference? Does it take away the illegality? The PAN number of LLP was also mentioned in some of the documents. The notice under 147 was not in conformity with the reasons to believe and the approval of the principal commissioner. It was in this background that the Delhi High Court held that the case fell within section 292B for the following reasons. I'm not reading those reasons, but this is where the entire controversy erupted. On one hand, you're saying it is an illegality, invalidity. When can it be an invalidity? When it is incurable, when it has no effect. And on the other hand, an irregularity can be regularized. So if you can say that, yes, 292B applies and it can be regularized in one case and it cannot be regularized in the other, and therefore in one it is illegal and the other it is irregularity, I am very sorry to say that reason with the greatest of respect will be incorrect. And this is where the Madras High Court is getting its genesis. This is where the Madras High Court is laying its source. So therefore, we cannot find really a fault there. And although it's not argued the way I put it across, but this is basically the reason. Somebody should be pointing it out to the courts now that once, can you say that the observations of the Supreme Court, that it is illegal, invalid, void, can you ignore that? That is duly supported even by a recent decision. And there is, I'm sorry, but there is no comparison between a case, as Sanjeev rightly pointed out, between there being a successor or there not being a successor, from recovering from one or not being able to recover from one, but recover from the other. is not a question of recovery. It's not a question of continuation of proceeding. It's a question of having passed an assessment order on a person who's non-existent. Not today, but in the earlier period, let's say in the 1930s, 40s, 50s, we have a spate of decisions where on dead person assessments were framed. They said, no, nothing doing. Even recently in 2015, under the, I think, Excise Act, there were no provisions for continuing on death of a person. And Justice Nariman held that since there is no provision, there can be no question of any assessment being framed on a dead person. But framing an assessment or continuing to fasten a liability are two separate things. They're not the same thing. And one, they have held it to be illegal. They have held it to be void. It can never be validated by holding that in another case on facts it is valid, and on this case on facts it is void. That will itself be a contradiction in terms. In fact, if we look at this, there is a that 2015 case, that is the case of Shabina Ibrahim. It is 2015 10 SCC 770. Shabina Ibrahim versus Collector of Central Excise, in which he's analyzed. And what is most important is, he says, to tax the dead is a contradiction in terms. Tax laws are made by the living to tax the living. What survives the dead person is what is left behind in the form of such person's property. A dead person's property in the form of his or her estate cannot be taxed without a necessary machinery provisions in a tax statute. Succession, just like that case of insurance, Gaurav, you please prompt me, wo jo insurance wala case tha, that they say if an asset gets destroyed, then the insurance premium, insurance claim what you receive cannot be taxed because the asset doesn't survive.
Money's case.
Yes. Supreme Court said that. So here also the person doesn't survive. So where is the question of saying that here this is the same as succession? Succession presupposes both are there. Although one is in the merged state and the other is not there. But in the dead person case, there is no succession. Succession may be in the loose term in the civil concept as such, but not under the Tax Act. That's why he says it cannot be taxed. So very unfortunately, I mean, I'm sorry to say this, but these loopholes have been left open by the Supreme Court itself. So today to say that Madras High Court is absolutely incorrect may not be right on our part, but yes, it can still be, to my mind, successfully and strongly and with conviction argued that once you say it is void, then there is no question of going into the facts of the case. And if you don't go into the facts of the case, void it was, void it is, and void it remains.
To add, Dharan, on your point, you made a point on the information. I think when you filed a petition in the court for amalgamation, I think a notice is issued to the,
it is.
To the tax officer also.
It is not to the officer. Not to the officer. What happens is, when the amalgamation is being finalized at that stage, it is issued to all the departments, whether it is Central Excise, whether it is CBDT, and then they are to represent. Yeah. If they don't represent, the proceedings don't get complete. So that was under the old law. There was even circulars issued, because what had happened was, in one case, the person did not come. And then they took a stand before the High Court saying, sorry, we have not been given an opportunity, we have not come. The High Court said, nothing doing, you've been given a notice. Henceforth, if you don't take proper notice, then it is not our fault. So then they stipulated by a circular that henceforth it will be given to the CBDT. Just as the tribunal's orders are now to be sent to one particular commissioner. Right. So that nobody can say tomorrow, I have not been served with this order.
So I think, Taran, the point is when it is sent to the department or a commissioner, I think in a way it is served on the department. Now, whether the commissioner or the CBDT does not give it to the assessing officer correctly, they cannot say that I was not intimated. So I think that point of an intimation, I think will get covered because of the notices which they are supposed to issue from the High Court to the respective departments. So I think that point will get covered. I thought I'll just clarify my own point that I think the notices do get issued to the departments.
Sanjeev, you are right. The notice is sent to the assessing officer and he has to categorically give a reply whether there is any demand or they have any objection. It is sent to the AO of the amalgamating company.
No, the board then sends to the relevant AO.
No, it is sent to the AO.
But because in an amalgamation proceeding, the AO is not a party.
No, because when the company, the court makes sure that whosoever is
So
involved,
they have to
all
furnish.
stakeholders, all
Yes, so they
stakeholders.
have, what happens is and tomorrow, if somebody comes forward and says, in the meantime, there is a transfer of jurisdiction. Somebody comes forward and says, sorry, you've issued it to the wrong AO. So now the standing instructions in the courts are that it would be issued to the Central Board of Direct Taxes. It is their duty to give it to any AO, whosoever they feel is important, whosoever they feel is the person holding the charge.
That is the situation now. But when the jurisdictional officers were there, the notices were sent, because in few of my cases, the notices were sent to the assessing officer.
बहुत अच्छी
With a
बात,
copy to the
you- you
commissioner.
will-
So I think it takes care of Taran's point that is the intimation a must. So I think that gets responded that even if you don't intimate, it will not be held against you. I thought I just put that point across that it cannot be held against you because there is a notice to the department.
There is a place where the courts have held in these very orders that the mere fact that you have participated in the proceedings, the mere fact that you have filed details in the hands of the amalgamated company on the letterhead of the amalgamated company, that should not go against you, because there can be no acquiescence against the statute. There can be no estoppel against the statute. So if that is so, on one hand, when they are saying this, then what importance do we give to this intimation? What importance do we give to those facts? Should we take up your questions one by one now, Tarun? Or they are answered?
I think most of them are answered. They're all answered.
Okay.
They're all answered.
All right.
Ajay has, it seems, just logged off. Gaurav, then we can proceed with the, Joseph, we can proceed with the next issue.
Absolutely,
Singh,
carry on. Yeah, move it.
No problem. You can start on the black money. Ajay has logged off because he has no black money.
Gaurav,
Right.
you can explain the facts.
Okay, all right. So friends, the third decision which we are taking up is this decision of Delhi Bench of Tribunal in Jatinder Mehra. This is important in the sense that this is first Delhi Tribunal decision on a Black Money Act subject. And two, it also lays down meaning of word beneficial owner that is used in section 2(11) of the BMA. So it's a first jurisprudence on this very issue from falling from Delhi Bench of Tribunal. Now, friends, in order to appreciate the controversy, it would be first important to understand the facts. The facts was that assessee herein was resident in India. He settled a trust in Cayman Islands. He's in the facts, it is noted that he was a nominal settler pursuant to a family settlement deed. His sons asked him to become a nominal settler of this trust in Cayman Islands. The trustee was a Cayman Island company of this very trust, and beneficiary, the assessee was not beneficiary in the trust, but the beneficiaries were sons and grandsons of the assessee. And then there were trusts in the bank account, and there were credits in the bank account of this Cayman Island trust, which was subsequently revoked, and all the funds were transferred in another company which was incorporated in British Virgin Islands. It was the BVI company, that is Watergate Advisors Limited. The company did not belong to the assessee. The shareholder and director of the company was son of the assessee. Now, this BVI company had a bank account in Singapore, and therefore the funds were credited in Singapore. In the Singapore bank account, in the account opening form, the assessee was named as the beneficial owner of the bank account. He did not sign the account opening form, nor did he ever traveled to Singapore to open the account, but his name was given. The facts state that it was out of gratitude that the son named him as the beneficial owner of that particular bank account. And the control of company was also not with him, in as much as the shareholder and director of the company was son of the assessee. The credits in the trust, which were subsequently transferred to the company, were also out of relations of the son. But the crux of the matter is that the assessee was named as the beneficial owner in the Singapore bank account, and therefore the controversy arose. The controversy arose because Section 211 of the Black Money Act says that if a resident assessee is inter alia beneficial owner of a foreign asset and he has not disclosed it in India, then this foreign asset would be deemed as an undisclosed foreign asset within the meaning of black money law, and therefore tax under the black money law can be imposed. On that basis, the department held that since assessee is named as beneficial owner in the bank account, it satisfies the test of definition of undisclosed foreign asset within the meaning of Section 211, and therefore they charged tax under the black money law. Now, when the matter has reached to the tribunal, tribunal is seized with examination of the meaning of the word beneficial owner. The word beneficial owner, although used in Section 211, but has not been defined in the Black Money Act. And therefore, in order to answer the meaning of this word, the tribunal draws support from meaning of this word given in various statutes. That is, first, Income Tax Act. In explanation 4 to Section 139(1), this beneficial owner word has been defined. So they use that meaning. They use general meaning given in the dictionaries. Then they also refer to definition of beneficial owner in Benami law, the definition contained in company law, the definition contained in PMLA. The sum and substance of all the decisions was twofold. One, a beneficial owner can be a person who either directly or indirectly contributes to that particular asset. He may not be in title the owner of that particular asset, but he has directly or indirectly contributed towards the ownership of that asset. Two, then they also, from the meanings of all these statutes, the other meaning is if the assessee is a beneficiary of the asset, even again, he is not the owner, but he is named as the beneficiary of the foreign asset, then also as per the tribunal, he could be considered as a beneficial owner. So after deciphering all the meanings, the tribunal go into the facts of the case. And on the facts, they held that while assessee has been named as the beneficial owner, but he had no locus in the either in the contribution of funds to the trust, because he was only a nominal settler. He was never the contributor to the trust. The source of funds credited in the trust were also with the business dealings of the son, with which he had no nexus. Two, he is not even the beneficiary in the trust, in as much as the trust deed says that on revocation of the trust, the funds of the trust will be transferred to another trust, but not to the family members of the assessee or the beneficiaries. So on these facts, tribunal ultimately come to the conclusion that the while assessee is named as beneficial owner, but that's not the criteria to determine a beneficial owner for the purpose of Black Money Act, and therefore they delete the addition made by the assessing officer. So to my mind, this decision is more on its facts. Yes, it has decified the meaning of the word beneficial owner, but this decision has been decided on its own facts, where there was no locus or nexus of funds in the trust were traced to the assessee, and therefore it cannot generally be applied that where the assessee is named as the beneficial owner in the bank account, that by itself will not be relevant to treat him as a owner of or a owner of undisclosed foreign asset within the meaning of BMA. We have to read the ratio of the decision along with the facts. The other important aspect which falls from this decision is whether we can draw a distinction between beneficial owner and beneficiary. While when we see Section 211 of the BMA, it only uses the word beneficial owner. But when we go to explanation 4 and 5 of Section 139(1), they define words beneficial owner and beneficiary separately. They define beneficial owner as the person who has contributed directly or indirectly to the ownership of the fund, whereas beneficiary is the person who enjoys the benefit of the fund. So can on that basis we say that the definition of beneficial owner in black money law is to be restricted to only a person who has contributed directly or indirectly to the fund, but is not merely the beneficiary of the fund. So many questions will arise from the decision and interpretation of the Act. One, what are the contours of a beneficial owner, whether the decision of tribunal is correct to say that only when there is nexus of funds that the assessee could be considered as a beneficial owner, and two, whether there is a distinction between beneficial and owner and beneficiary for the purposes of charge of tax under the black money law. So these are the questions I will throw open, and I'll request Taran also if he has some points to supplement on this very decision.
Just one point. When I was going through this judgment, the Honorable ITAT first, yes, they, for interpreting the term beneficial owner, they resort to provisions of Section 139. They draw a conclusion therefrom. But then thereafter, they also go to the provisions of Companies Act. They also go to the Benami Prohibition Act. They also go to the PMLA statute to seek definition to the meaning of that term from those very acts. On this, I would just like to invite that when originally this Black Money Act was passed, board had issued FAQs. One of the FAQs was question number 31, and a specific issue was that what happens that if you are a beneficial owner as per the PMLA, but you're not a beneficial owner as per Section 139. On that, the court clarified that we will only take, for filing declaration under Section 59, the assessee should only take the meaning of beneficial owner as taken under Section 139 of the Act, and definition as provided under PMLA should not be resorted. Another important issue which may be taken into consideration is that the scope of charge under the Black Money Act. The scope of charge under the Black Money Act is for two defaults. One is for non-reporting, and second is that if you don't disclose an income from a particular source. Here in this case, rightly or wrongly, if there is a name, I'm speaking from the side of the department, it is that the default is not of reporting. Can the default of not reporting extend to even remotely where someone can say that you are a beneficial owner, although on facts you are not a beneficial owner? Day in, day out, we open bank accounts, we fill in names of nominees. The account opener himself fills in the name of the nominee. The signature of the nominee is not required unless or until the nominee is a minor. So once the name of the nominee is given in a bank account, will you say that the nominee is a beneficial owner? That partly, yes, the tribunal answers. So to what extent can we stretch the definition of beneficial owner? Do we restrict it to Section 139, or do we go to other statutes and we enlarge the definition? That's one of the points which I will just like to request the seniors to consider. Sir, you are on mute. Ajay sir. Ajay sir, you are on mute.
Ajay sir, you are muted. Please unmute yourself.
Unmute. Okay, sorry.
आप लॉक्ड ऑफ हो गए थे सर अपना ब्लैक मनी देखने।
अरे मेरी बत्ती चली गई थी यार, वो बत्ती फिर आई तो फिर इसमें चक्कर रही।
शाली सर कह रहे थे आप ब्लैक मनी छुपाने चले गए।
No, I said I was praising you and saying that he is not interested in black money.
हाँ, क्योंकि सारा वाइट है अपने पास, हमने ब्लैक मनी करना क्या है? ये बात है।
गौरव झगड़ा मत कराओ।
Ingest sir, ingest.
हमारी 40 साल 30 साल की दोस्ती को खराब करने में लगे थे नए बच्चे। Sir, as Taran pointed out, there are two defaults. One is on account of non-reporting, and other is inability to prove the source of the money in the bank account, foreign bank account. Now, sir, if you look at the proviso to Section 139, where it is mandated to disclose, the disclosure aspect I'm speaking of. So they say they take into account 3 situations where you have to disclose. Situation 1, when you are a beneficial owner or otherwise of the asset. That means the money is yours, as Gaurav has put it. Or you have the signing authority in the account. And then also the third, even when you are a beneficiary in an asset located outside. So they have covered all the 3 situations. You may have benefited on account of somebody's leaving the money to you. You may be a signatory or you may be a beneficial owner. All 3 situations you have to report. Now, the fact that we have the case that we have is one where the form for being, let us say, a beneficiary was submitted by the assessee's brother in the bank account, thereby making the assessee the beneficiary in the account. I hope I'm right on that. He may not be a beneficial owner, but he becomes a beneficiary. Otherwise, what use is the form, signed or unsigned? So as far as 139 is concerned, he becomes liable. He had to report, which he did not. I'm not going to the signatory aspect, but he had to report. But now, coming into the punishment aspect, the offenses and prosecution, if we look at Black Money Act, sir, section 49 and 50, they talk of the punishment. And in the punishment, they take into account the entire, all the three persons who are beneficial owners or otherwise signing authority and the beneficiary, both for non-intimation as well as the willful attempt to tax. Now, the point that I'm trying to make out is, and if you also, and before that, if you go to page 19, para 25 of the order, sir, I'm not able to understand why, how.
Can you please read section 49?
Section 49, okay. So section 49 says, punishment for failure to furnish return in relation to foreign income and asset. That means that, because, sir, the failure is also governed by Black Money. Income Tax Act will not punish for this. If a person being a resident other than ordinary resident in India within the meaning of section clause 6 of the Income Tax Act, who at any time during the previous year held any asset located outside India as a beneficial owner or otherwise, or was the beneficiary of such an asset, or had income from of a source outside India and willfully fails to furnish the return income which is required to furnish under subsection 1 of section 139 of the Act, he shall be punishable with rigorous imprisonment for a year, which shall not be less than 6 months, but which may extend to 7 years and fine. Then, sir, the similar are the wordings there in the next section. That is punishment for failure to return, to furnish in return of income any information about an asset. So in the return, information about the asset, financial asset location. Then punishment for willful attempt to evade tax. 51. If a person being a resident other than ordinary resident in India within the meaning of such and such willfully attempts in any manner whatsoever to evade any tax penalty or interest chargeable or imposable under this Act, he shall be punishable with rigorous imprisonment for return such and such. So, sir, this is on account of concealment. And the other 49 is on account of non-reporting. Now, sir, the point that I'm trying to make is, if we look at para 25, page 19 of the judgment, when it comes to interpreting the meaning of the word beneficial ownership, the learned judge clearly says that the meaning given in section 139(1) of the Act is not to be taken into account. I will just read that 2-3 lines. According to the provision of section 84 of the Black Money Act, only certain provisions of the Income Tax Act are made applicable to the Black Money Act. This section does not include the provisions of section 139(1) of the Income Tax Act. Therefore, the beneficial ownership is required to be understood with respect to its dictionary meaning and also other provisions of other statutes, keeping in mind the nature of the object and purposes of the Black Money Act. So, he ousts the source of the default, at least as far as reporting is concerned, to say that the meaning given in 139(1) is not to be taken into account. I'm not able to understand this this aspect.
You wanted to say something, Gaurav?
Yes. May I come in, sir? So,
Yeah.
So I'll just supplement and bring in more facts. One, sir, when we see section 49, it only talks about non-reporting on account of being a beneficial owner or a beneficiary. So the third requirement of signatory
Is not there.
Is not there. And when we read the judgment, the court has said that in this case, the assessee was neither the beneficial owner nor beneficiary, because on revocation of the trust, funds were to be given to another trust, not to the family members of the assessee. So therefore, he was both not the beneficial owner and beneficiary. And for that reason, possibly there is no default of section 49. And now to this paragraph 25, which you read, that Honorable Judge has said that we do not have to restrict to meaning in Income Tax Act. One, as Taran has pointed out, that FAQ 31, the CBDT has itself answered that we have to take the meaning in Income Tax Act and not the PMLA. And two, if we see, sir, section 2(15) of this Black Money Act, it says all other words and expressions used herein, but not defined and defined in the Income Tax Act shall have the meanings respectively assigned to them in that act. So section 215 says that you have to borrow the meanings from the Income Tax Act. So the question would be whether we can directly borrow the meanings of beneficial owner and beneficiary from Income Tax Act, or we have to go beyond Income Tax Act and see dictionary meanings and other acts.
But section 215 says you have to.
Provided that definition is for the entire act. When we see explanation 4 and 5, it is for the purpose of section 139(1) only. So it will be an open question whether we can expand and take that meaning to the general meaning of that word in the BMA.
Well, actually, in this paragraph 25, if we read it a little more carefully, they have said that 139 definition under explanation 4 can be taken, but cannot be taken in isolation. This is what they say. However, as the entity involved where the money is found credited, it needs to be examined whether the assessee has beneficial ownership on these companies' entities. As stated earlier, Black Money Act does not define the term beneficial ownership, and the Income Tax Act explanation 4 to 139(1) defines the same.
Sir,
however, it is not necessary that to examine the provisions of Black Money Act, only the definition provided under the income tax is required to be seen. That means it is not to be seen in isolation. You have to see other acts also. That's why besides 139(1) explanation 4, they take up the definitions under other statutes also, definitions also.
So, sir, further, let's read according
to the provisions of section 84 of the Black Money Act, only certain provisions of the Income Tax Act are made applicable to the Black Money Act. The section does not include the provisions of section 139(1) of the Act. Therefore, the beneficial ownership is required to be understood with respect to its dictionary meaning and also other provisions of other statute, also keeping in mind the nature of the object and purposes of the Black Money Act. They are not ruling it out totally.
It's a jargon of words, but from the last four lines, it does come out that other than one.
In any case, tell me one thing.
Look at everything else.
In any case, tell me one thing. What is the contradiction between 139(1) explanation 4 and the meaning that you want to adopt? Because it will be relevant only if there is some contradiction. What are you getting under 139(1) explanation 4, which you are not getting otherwise? And which is what is saving you and which you feel it will not save you if you go by the other definition?
So if you look at
the normal dictionary meaning.
Take minute. There's a problem here because we are almost nearing 5:27. So let me just give you quickly actually what I was thinking and what was my line of thought in this. You see, in 211, the words used are beneficial owner. As Gaurav rightly pointed out, there is a difference between beneficial owner and a beneficiary. For example, there are some Canadian Supreme Court decisions which have clearly outlined the difference between a beneficial owner and a person beneficially entitled thereto. So although a beneficiary in its general sense may include both a beneficial owner and a person beneficially entitled thereto, but a beneficial owner, they say, is different. It doesn't mean beneficially entitled thereto. If you talk about, I'll give you that citation. Just a minute. That citation is Frank M. Convert versus Minister of Finance, it is reported in 1982 SCR 774. And the relevant discussions is at page they neither have paragraphs nor pages on it. It is SEC online. But anyway, the citation is there, so I'm sure it's a very detailed discussion between the two, and they've referred to at least 5 to 10 other decisions on this issue itself. The other decisions that you may refer to for this is the decision of Prevost Car Incorporated versus CIT. This is again Tax Court of Canada. Fortunately, it's reported in 42taxman.com 150. Now, if you look at the detailed meaning of the word beneficial owner and what is the difference then? The difference between a beneficial owner is beneficial owner ke andar to nahi aa raha hai. That is what they have analyzed. Now, the question is, does it come within the beneficiary or the enlarged definition? Now, if we look at the various meanings, beneficiary is always with reference to the income. Beneficiary of the asset only at dissolution, not on a year-to-year basis. And that is evident from your explanation 5. Explanation 5 says, we need not pick it up bodily and say it doesn't come within this, therefore it doesn't come within the other. We are only gathering the ingredients. For the purpose of this section, beneficiary in respect of an asset means an individual who derives benefit from the asset during the previous year. And the consideration for such asset has been provided by any person other than such beneficiary. So he's got some benefit out of it, something in the nature of an inflow, may not be income, maybe capital, whatever. So there is some benefit that has to flow. In this case, which was dealt with by the tribunal, there is no benefit that flows. He's only a beneficiary indicated to the bank, and they have very categorically given a finding that it is not as if the beneficial owner is in a blank. The beneficial owner is very much evident from the facts of the case. His son has owned up that yes, I am the beneficial owner. So it is not as if one is lost, you have nobody else to go to. This is a case on its own facts. I would only say use this case with caution. Don't use it otherwise. But yes, the case certainly does have some pitfalls also. I don't want to get into that because those pitfalls will unnecessarily weaken the case and unnecessarily strengthen the hands of, because isme appeal abhi fir bhi ja rahi ho. So I don't want to get into that mess. But yes, if you want to note down, you can note down what are the things which are required. For example, for a beneficial ownership, there are 3 things which are necessary: exclusive possession and control over the income received. 2, no requirement for the recipient to seek approval or obtain consent. You can cull it out from those decisions. No requirement for the recipient to seek approval or obtain consent from another for making investment. And 3, freedom to utilize the income received at recipient's sole and absolute discretion, unconstrained by any obligation. Similarly, in the other case, beneficial owner, they were considering vis-a-vis dividend. And they said, now here they've gone into negative. Who can be said to be only a pass-on entity and not the real beneficial owner? So they have given the criteria there that the person who cannot be treated as a beneficial owner is one who has narrow powers, who has performed mere fiduciary or administrative functions, acted on account of a beneficiary, just title to the property and no other economic, legal or practical attributes of ownership, and performed similar functions to those of an agent or a nominee by way of contract or any other obligation. I'm sure you can cull out these from those decisions. So there are many aspects of this beneficial ownership which we need to consider. But we need to give due credence, due weightage to the fact that they have used beneficial owner. And it has its own connotation, limitations, as understood within the legal circles. So you can't confuse a beneficial owner with a beneficiary. Now 211 uses the word only beneficial owner and not a beneficiary. Whereas the other sections uses 49, that's why I asked you to read it, 49, 50, 51. But then the beneficiary there has to be in the context of what is the benefit derived by them, not otherwise. And there is no benefit in this case being derived by this person under any circumstances. The master stroke, as I told you also, was the memorandum of family settlement, which they said determines the rights and obligations. So that's why I again reiterate, it's a decision on its own facts.
Sir, इससे यहाँ से ये भी लगता है that the bank statement never came to the department. It was only the form that they adjudicated upon. Probably the bank statement would have shown a different story. It looks like it because there's no discussion on that at all.
Obviously, the bank statement is normally sent to the person who operates the accounts.
True.
They don't go by the form which says that who's the beneficiary. It's not necessary because he had no authority to sign that account. So the bank statement would have gone to that email or mobile banking or desktop banking to that identity, which is not a person who's this person. So that would also have not really established the connection.
Perhaps.
Anyway, thank you all so much. I'm sorry.
Excellent, sir. Excellent. I think can we have Ranjan? Are you there?
No, Ranjan is not there. He's asked me to.
So let's have Mr. Anil Bhalla if he's there. Anil Bhalla, sir?
Yes.
Yes, sir. A vote of thanks. Appreciate the cardio.
Thank you for this great deliberations. Thank you, Gaurav, Tarandeep, for giving us your views on the 3 case laws. It has been a good experience for me. Thank you, Sanjeev, for explaining what you believe your understanding was and which was correct. It is substantiated by Mr. Siali. And Mr. Siali, thank you so much. And I think you have to say thank you to Ajay because he's finished at 5:30 sharp before you fly off. So it's thank you all around. Thank you to the bar for organizing this after so long. And we look forward to a physical meeting at some point of time. Thank you.
Thank you very much, sir. Thank you very much. Just one word, though I shouldn't be. Taran and Gaurav, you know, these gems from Mr. Siali and Mr. Chaudhary, if you could just also give us brief synopsis for everybody. You also have a great collection. If you could just 2 pages, it'll be excellent.
Sure.
And thank you so much from my side to Mr. Siali and Mr. Chaudhary. We'll be bothering you far more than sir. In fact, what we were thinking, probably we can have few frequent meetings till it really opens up on decisions. So some more 2-3 decisions in the next 15-20 days. And Siali Saab, we'll have to have your time on this. And so also Sanjeev. Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you, Anil.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Good day. Bye-bye. Have a good week.